The Russian president says the United States is promoting terrorism by financing militant groups and sowing the seeds of division among nations. Vladimir Putin added that the US and its allies are still providing direct funding and weapons to the anti-government Takfiri militants operating in Syria. The Russian president noted that this is one reason why the ISIL Takfiri group has turned into a de facto army. He said that because of US support, ISIL has become powerful, justifying Washington's unilateralism. Putin also advised those supporting terrorism to reflect on what they are doing, adding that one day the terrorists will turn on them and bring death and destruction to their countries. Here's more.
Tensions continue between Russia and the West, especially the US, with Moscow showing no signs of taking a step back in the face of pressure from Western countries. In his latest remarks on the tensions, the Russian President Vladimir Putin once again criticized Western countries, particularly the US, over their attitude towards Moscow. Putin accused Washington of trying to impose its will on other countries, something which, he said, has destabilized the world.
Maybe the exceptional way in which the United States implements their leadership brings goodness for everybody. Maybe their intervention in the whole world's affairs brings calmness, wellness, progress, prosperity, democracy, and what we need to do is to just relax and enjoy. I dare to say that this is not true.
The Russian president also criticized US interference in other countries as arbitrary. Instead, he urged talks on internationally acceptable conditions for any use of force.
Instead of a regulation of conflicts, there is escalation. Instead of a city sovereign states, there is growing chaos, and instead of democracy, there is support of a pretty doubtful group, from open neo-Nazis to extremists. And why they support them? Because on a certain level, they are being used as a tool for reaching their goals.
Well, he's absolutely correct. The United States has been overthrowing countries for decades. Washington has an ideology of world domination, and its ideology requires it to prevent the emergence of other strong countries. And any country that doesn't buckle to Washington ends up with sanctions.
A series of events and efforts by the US and its allies in recent years have plummeted relations between Russia and the West to lowest levels since the end of the Cold War era in the early 1990s. The US led military expeditions to Afghanistan and Iraq, respectively, in 2001 and 2003, alarmed Russia. Then came Syria, which has been the scene of a foreign-backed insurgency against the government in Damascus for the past few years. Russia, Syria and several other countries see the insurgency as a part of a US-backed plot to bring about regime change in Syria to install a Western puppet government in the Arab country. The war on Syria has produced no results for the adversaries of the Syrian government, that is the US and its regional Arab and non-Arab allies. Moscow itself played a pivotal role in supporting the government of Syria. Russia, along with China, vetoed several anti-Syrian resolutions drafted at the UN Security Council by the US or its allies. The resolutions, Moscow and Beijing said, were aimed at paving the way for military intervention in Syria to topple the country's president, Bashar al-Assad. Ukraine has been the last link in the chain of tensions between Russia and the US. Russia sees the new government in Kiev as a puppet of the West and all anti-Russian pressure as a part of a scenario to help bring NATO even nearer to the Russian borders. Moscow has repeatedly warned Ukraine against joining NATO, saying the eastward expansion of the Western military alliance is aimed at encircling Russia.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has accused the U.S. of trying to impose its will on other countries. Putin said Washington's policy has destabilized the world. The Russian president also criticized U.S. interference in other countries as arbitrary. Instead, he urged talks on internationally acceptable conditions for any use of force. Putin also condemned Western sanctions against Moscow over the crisis in Ukraine. He, however, said the sanctions will not force his country to beg, as Russia is, quote, strong. Putin added that Russia did not initiate the ongoing tensions between Moscow and the West. He said the, quote, so-called winners of the Cold War want to redraw the entire world exclusively for themselves. Tensions between Russia and the West have hit levels unprecedented since the Cold War era, which came to an end in the early 1990s. To discuss that further, I'm joined by Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, who is the former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, and he's joining us live now via Skype from Florida. Dr. Roberts, as always, thanks for joining us. Now, how do you react to President Putin's statement, quite a strong statement by him that Russia will not be intimidated?
Well, he's absolutely correct. The United States has been overthrowing countries for decades. Washington has an ideology of world domination. And its ideology requires it to prevent the emergence of other strong countries. And any country that doesn't buckle to Washington ends up with sanctions, such as Iran, Russia. That's just the way Washington operates. So there's nothing controversial about what Putin said. I think it's a good thing that he cleared the air by making the statement. The American empire is large. It includes all of Europe, East and West, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and it has a few other countries here and there. It's a very large empire, and it's disturbed by the rise of Russia and China.
And Dr. Roberts, though, on this issue of sanctions, I wanted to ask, because certainly sanctions are having somewhat of an effect on the Russian economy, of course, coming from the United States, which is a very large economy, obviously, worldwide. I'm wondering, though, I was reading an article, and maybe you can correct me if this is incorrect, but they had said that pretty much the BRICS nations need to play ball with Russia in countering the U.S. dollar and these effects of the sanctions, and those BRICS nations specifically being the likes of China, India, and Brazil. Do you think that other nations will support Russia in this stance against the U.S. at this time?
Well, not the members of the American empire, but all of those countries are not doing well economically. They are in recession or headed into recession. I think the time of the West has passed. And so I expect that the misuse of the dollar as world reserve currency by Washington is encouraging a move away from the use of the dollar. And as this develops, then Washington's power will slowly erode. So I think that Washington has peaked in power some time back, and that the world is going to reform in new ways that are multipolar and that acknowledge the aspirations of other countries, something that Washington refuses to do.
And finally, Dr. Roberts, we just have under a minute left. I wanted to ask then, certainly, I would imagine you're not the only one sitting in the U.S. who understands that the U.S. is essentially hitting itself over the head. So I'm wondering then, is this an issue of bad advice being given, or is this just an issue of pure belligerence on the part of the U.S.?
It's an issue of ideology. It's a neoconservative ideology that the United States alone in the world is exceptional, indispensable, and has the right to impose its will on the rest of the world. It's an ideology. It's the neoconservative ideology. It is a very dangerous ideology. It's produced 13 years of war in the Middle East. And if it continues, it will produce war with Russia and China and Iran. It's a dangerous ideology. The world has to become aware of this fact.
Indeed. Okay, well, we'll leave it there for now, but of course, as always, we do sincerely appreciate your analysis. That was Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, the former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, who is speaking to us live via Skype from Florida.